Ethan Vance had always known the land would shape his fate, but nothing in his past could have prepared him for the day the wind changed and the world he knew began to unravel. The wind, a constant companion in Echo Valley, carried dust like it carried forgotten stories, soft, slow, and aching for someone to listen. It whispered through the skeletal branches of cottonwood trees, hummed across the vast, sun-baked expanses, and sighed through the weathered planks of Ethan Vance's ranch house. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, his fingers crusted with hay and the honest sweat of a solitary life. The sun, a burning disk of orange and gold, had dipped behind the distant mesas, casting the sprawling land in that ethereal golden hush where everything birds, men, even regrets seemed to hold its breath. This Echo Valley was a place of stark, untamed beauty, a vast canvas of ochre earth, sagebrush, and rock, where the silence was so profound it often hummed louder than any sound. It was here, in this remote, wild corner of the American West, that Ethan, a former cowboy who had willingly shed the demands of the bustling towns and crowded trails, had chosen to disappear. He scratched behind the ear of Tracker, his old cattle dog, a loyal shadow whose silvering muzzle spoke of years spent faithfully by Ethan's side. Together, they watched the horizon as if it owed them an answer it never gave, a truth hidden just beyond the visible world. Ethan lived alone, not by the cruel hand of tragedy, but by deliberate choice, a deep-seated weariness of a world that had, over time, sifted and sorted, leaving behind only what was stubborn or sacred. Ethan had become both. He wasn't running from a specific heartbreak or a grand mistake, but from the relentless clamor of human expectation, the endless compromises, and the slow erosion of one's own spirit under the weight of society. His isolation was a mantle, heavy but comforting, a shield against the complexities he no longer wished to navigate. His days followed a predictable, unspoken rhythm, the first light bringing chores, the midday sun offering respite, and the twilight hours dissolving into the profound quiet of the stars. It was a life devoid of loud emotions, a carefully constructed fortress of solitude. Yet, even in the most resolute quiet, life had a way of stirring. That evening, as the long shadows of the pasture stretched and deepened, something new appeared on the western horizon. 3 riders. They moved slowly, deliberately, their forms silhouetted against the last vestiges of daylight, not hiding, but not hurrying either. Sauk, Ethan's senses, honed by years in the wilderness, prickled with an unaccustomed alertness. One figure, clearly the elder, sat tall in the saddle, carved by wind and winters, radiating an undeniable authority. 2 women rode slightly behind him, one a shade ahead, her posture straight and proud, the other glancing sideways with a subtle, weighing gaze, as if assessing the vastness of the world around her, and perhaps of Ethan's own isolated existence. Ethan stepped off the porch, his movements slow and measured, but he did not reach for his rifle. There was no aggression in their approach, only a quiet, almost ceremonial advance. The older man halted his horse a respectful distance from the ranch house, his eyes, deep and knowing, meeting Ethan's across the twilight space. He radiated an ancient wisdom, a quiet power that commanded attention without a single shouted word. "I am Kishon," the chief said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, like river rock smoothed by centuries of flowing water. "These are my daughters, Lana and Elara." Their names hung in the crisp evening air, simple and resonant, like beads on a finely spun thread. each one carrying the weight of generations, of a history far older than anything Ethan had known in his own solitary life. Ethan offered a curt, almost imperceptible nod in return, his usual response to any direct address, a gesture that spoke volumes about his nature reserved, observational, and deeply reticent. "What brings you to Echo Valley?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse, scraping like dry earth. Chief Kishon dismounted with a careful, almost ritualistic grace, his movements unhurried, deliberate. He stood before Ethan, his presence commanding yet devoid of threat. "We do not come to wage war, nor to deliver a warning," the chief stated, his gaze sweeping across the desolate expanse of Ethan's ranch, taking in the uncultivated fields, the silent house, the solitary man. "We simply observe. A man who has long carried his solitude, much like our own people have carried their journey." The words landed with an unexpected, almost physical impact, going deeper than they should have, bypassing Ethan's defenses and touching a raw, vulnerable chord within him. It wasn't an accusation, but a profound observation, a quiet challenge to the fortress he had built around himself. Ethan's throat tightened, a rare knot of emotion constricting his usual composure. He felt the weight of those words, the silent acknowledgement of a past self he had deliberately buried beneath layers of solitude and indifference. The chief's words implied a connection, a shared understanding of a certain way of being that transcended language or tribe, a recognition of an unspoken loneliness. "We come with an offer," Chief Kishon continued, his voice softening just slightly, though his gaze remained steadfast. "You have no woman, no fire within your hearth. She," he motioned subtly to Lana, who sat upon her horse, unmoving, a figure carved from stoic resolve, "is willing, if you are." The silence that followed was immense, heavy, and felt almost holy. Lana didn't step forward, didn't offer even a hint of a smile. She sat tall upon her horse, a silent sculpture of strength, her dark hair braided tight against her back. Her eyes, deep set and shadowed, held a quiet watchfulness that spoke of trials endured and wisdom gained, a steady gaze that met Ethan's with an unnerving calm. There was no hint of desperation in her posture, only a quiet dignity, a profound sense of self-possession that both intrigued and unnerved Ethan. "I don't need charity," Ethan said, his voice low, almost a whisper, more to himself than to them. The very idea of his life being a subject of pity pricked at something raw within him, a fiercely independent pride that recoiled from any suggestion of need. "It is not charity," Chief Kishon countered softly, his eyes still fixed on Ethan. "It is a path. Our path brought us here, and now it crosses yours. A choice to walk this path, or to remain apart. The sun shines on both." The wind blew again, a gentle sigh through the valley, carrying the scent of sage and distant dust. Ethan's fingers flexed, clenching around nothing, a phantom grasp for a rifle he hadn't touched, or perhaps for a life he had left behind. He looked at the chief, then at Lana, whose gaze remained steady, unwavering, a silent question in her dark eyes. He didn't agree, not with a spoken word, not with a welcoming gesture, but he didn't turn them away. He simply nodded once, a single, decisive movement that wasn't agreement, but a quiet, almost reluctant surrender to a question he never thought he'd have to answer. It was an unspoken acceptance of a new, unforeseen current in the quiet stream of his life, a reluctant acknowledgement that the solitude he cherished might not be the only path. Without another word, Chief Kishon and his daughters turned their horses, descending the ridge, their figures slowly disappearing like dusk consuming the last light of day. They set up camp down by the dry creek bed, a few ridges to the east, their fire a flickering beacon in the growing darkness. Jonas stood alone on his porch, watching their silhouettes vanish into the vast, silent landscape. This quiet acceptance, this unspoken pact, marked the beginning of a strange new rhythm in the lonely hollow, a subtle shift in the winds of Ethan Vance's life. The echoes of the valley seemed to carry a new sound now, a silent promise, or perhaps a silent challenge. The first morning after their strange encounter, the silence on Ethan Vance's ranch felt different. It was no longer the comfortable, familiar quiet he had cultivated for years, but a pregnant stillness, charged with the lingering presence of the Sauk and Chief Kishon's unsettling words. He found himself scanning the eastern ridges more often, a habit born of an unexpected curiosity. He tried to dismiss it as mere vigilance, a cowboy's natural wariness of newcomers. Yet, deep down, he knew it was more. It was a subtle pull, a whisper against the carefully constructed walls of his isolation. When the sun finally crested the distant mountains, casting long purple shadows across Echo Valley, a small, meticulously stacked pile of kindling appeared beside his porch. The wood, cut cleanly and bone dry, was nestled next to a folded square of buckskin cloth resting on the railing. Tracker, usually indifferent to anything but cattle and the occasional rabbit, sniffed at it with a curious whine, then wagged his tail, a rare burst of enthusiasm that startled Ethan. He picked up the cloth, feeling the soft, supple texture beneath his calloused fingers. It was simple, yet deliberate, a silent offering. Ethan said nothing aloud, but his gaze lingered on the neatly piled wood, a small, unbidden warmth stirring within him. It was a gesture he hadn't asked for, nor expected, yet it sat there, undeniable, a quiet counterpoint to the vast emptiness he had embraced. The days that followed settled into a new, unspoken rhythm. Lana never sought his attention, nor did she approach his cabin directly. Instead, her presence became a subtle, consistent thread woven into the fabric of his mornings. She would materialize with the earliest light, a graceful silhouette against the awakening sky. Moving along the distant fence line or by the old creek bed, she would deposit some carefully chosen item, a handful of wild berries, a small bundle of medicinal roots, or the ever-present stack of kindling, then recede back into the landscape before he could form a single thought into words. On the third morning, a satchel of finely ground corn awaited him, its rim adorned with intricate Sauk symbols, stars and waves, designs of a people deeply connected to the land and sky. Ethan's fingers traced the precise stitching, a strange fascination holding him. Each offering was practical, thoughtful, meant to ease the burdens of a solitary life. And each left an indelible mark on the landscape of his quiet world, slowly eroding the boundaries of his self-imposed solitude. He found himself subtly altering his own routines. Unconsciously, he began to give more care to his appearance, running a comb through his unruly hair more often, scraping his razor across his jaw with renewed attention. His work shirts, once merely functional, were now routinely brushed clean of dust and hay, a small ritual of respect for an unseen audience. The heavy, bolted door of his ranch house, once a stark declaration of his impermeability, now often stood slightly ajar, as if inviting the very world he had tried to shut out. These weren't grand admissions of change, not yet, but they were gestures, small concessions to an internal shift he hadn't fully articulated, even to himself. He began to leave his coffee pot on the fire longer, brewing extra, an unspoken invitation for a guest who might never show. He watched Lana's movements from a distance, observing the quiet strength in her stride, the way she seemed to merge with the landscape, as if she were as much a part of Echo Valley as the ancient rocks and whispering winds. Her silence, rather than being a barrier, became a language he was slowly, reluctantly learning to understand. A quiet symphony of care that resonated deeply within him. One morning, as the sun began its ascent, Elara, Lana's younger sister, lingered. She was curious, her mischievous spirit barely hidden beneath a veneer of youthful shyness, her eyes bright with an almost impish knowing. Ethan, feeling her gaze, paused. He had grown accustomed to Lana's fleeting presence, but Elara's directness was a different kind of challenge, a small, vibrant spark in his muted world. Lana will not ask for what is not freely given, Elara stated plainly, her voice surprisingly steady for such a young girl, cutting through the morning stillness. She has offered what she has, and her pride is not a thing to be bruised by repetition. The words struck Ethan with the force of a physical blow, a stark illumination of the unspoken dynamics between them. He hadn't seen Lana's gestures as a form of request, merely as silent acts of goodwill. But Elara's blunt honesty recast them, highlighting the profound patience and quiet dignity with which Lana had approached him. It painted a picture of a woman who had offered her essence, not as a desperate plea, but as a deliberate choice, and who would not chase what was not freely given. The realization stirred a minor tempest within Ethan's usually calm mind, a conflict between his ingrained need for solitude and the undeniable allure of this quiet, persistent connection. "I haven't agreed to anything," Ethan replied, his voice gruff, defensive, yet lacking his usual conviction. He felt a need to justify his continued hesitation, to protect the fragile boundaries of his self-imposed isolation. Elara's eyes, however, held no judgment, only a knowing truth that seemed to settle in the very air around them. "And you have not refused," she simply stated, her youthful wisdom cutting through his excuses. She then turned and darted away, disappearing into the shadows of the valley as quickly as she had appeared, leaving Ethan to grapple with the profound simplicity of her words. He had indeed never said no. He had merely existed, watched, and quietly accepted, allowing the silent gestures to accumulate, slowly chipping away at the fortress walls. That night, a cold swept into Echo Valley, not the biting, harsh cold of winter, but the kind that crept in, insidious and pervasive, settling deep into the bones. Ethan looked at the hearth of his ranch house, a gaping maw of brick and ash, and realized with a start that he hadn't lit a fire in days, perhaps weeks. The cold within the house felt less physical and more spiritual, a reflection of the chill he had allowed to settle in his own heart. Yet, as he stood there, a strange paradox emerged. Something within him had already begun warming without the aid of firewood. It was the warmth of observation, of quiet anticipation, of a burgeoning connection he had stubbornly resisted acknowledging. He walked to the window, drawn by an invisible thread. Outside, under the pale glow of the moon, Lana was walking toward the distant ridge, her silhouette stark against the night sky, moonlight catching the edge of her shawl. She didn't turn around, didn't look back, simply walked on, a quiet, resolute figure moving deeper into the vastness. Her silent departure underscored the truth of Elara's words. Lana would not beg. She had made her offer. And now, the choice was entirely Ethan's. The warmth in his chest, so new and fragile, tightened. A quiet longing for a fire he hadn't realized he so desperately needed. He found himself wrestling with a powerful new question. Had his choice of solitude truly been a refuge, or merely a different kind of prison? The answer, he instinctively knew, lay not in words, but in action. The quiet shifts in Ethan's routine, the almost imperceptible opening of his world, did not escape the notice of the wider, less forgiving world. Though Echo Valley felt vast and isolated, news, like dust, had a way of settling everywhere. The subtle, unspoken connection blossoming between Ethan and Lana was not a secret that could be kept indefinitely from the prying eyes and wagging tongues of those in Copper Creek, the nearest town, a place where tradition clung fiercely and outsiders were viewed with suspicion. A town whose dusty streets often churned with idle gossip and deeply ingrained prejudice. One particularly clear afternoon, as the sun beat down with its usual relentless intensity, 3 wagons rumbled down the dusty track leading to Ethan's ranch. They belonged to men from Copper Creek, faces Ethan recognized, though he rarely engaged with them beyond a curt nod or a shared glance over livestock prices. There was Jedediah Stone, a lumbering man with a perpetually sneering lip, whose forced smiles never quite reached his cold eyes. Beside him sat Silas Blackwood, whose gaze held a glint of deep-seated resentment, perhaps stemming from old, forgotten slights, or merely the general envy of a man who cherished his quiet competence. And in the lead wagon, Elias Thorne, a self-proclaimed pillar of the community, whose booming laugh often masked a cruel edge. A man who saw any deviation from his own narrow path as a personal affront. These were men who had once called Ethan neighbor, or even brother in the casual parlance of the frontier. But now their faces were set, their gazes sharp, accusatory, like buzzards circling a dying animal. They came not for trade or idle chat, but to deliver judgment. Ethan, sensing their intent, stepped off his porch, his hand resting casually on the worn wood of the railing, but not reaching for his rifle. He met their stares with his usual unblinking calm, a facade that rarely betrayed the churn of his thoughts. The wagons pulled to a halt a dozen yards from his house, raising a cloud of fine, red dust that hung in the still air, a tangible manifestation of their unwelcome presence. "Heard you been entertainin' mighty peculiar company, Vance?" Jedediah drawled, his voice thick with sarcasm, his eyes darting towards the eastern ridges where the Sauk camp lay, a barely veiled sneer twisting his mouth. A low, guttural chuckle rippled through the group, a chorus of thinly disguised malice. "Figured you for a man of standards, Ethan," Silas spat, his words laced with contempt, cutting through the hot air. "Didn't figure you for a Sauk sympathizer. Thought you had more sense than to cozy up with that kind." The insult hung heavy, designed to sting, to strip away any shred of his perceived respectability, to brand him as an outcast. They laughed louder then, a coarse, jarring sound that grated on Ethan's ears, amplified by the silent judgment of the valley itself. "What did they promise you? Gold? Or just a little native charm?" Elias called out, his voice booming across the valley, deliberately loud enough for any ears to hear, even those beyond the ridges, intending for his words to carry far and wide, poisoning the air. The implication was clear. Ethan was weak, easily swayed, perhaps even compromised by his association with the people they deemed uncivilized, wild, and utterly beneath them. Ethan said nothing. His silence, a weapon he had long wielded, was now his only defense against their poisonous words. He simply stared them down, his gaze unwavering, betraying neither anger nor fear, only a profound, almost weary stillness. He had faced down men of ill intent before, men with guns and knives. But this was different. This wasn't about land or cattle. It was about something far more insidious, the corrosive power of prejudice, the judgment of a society that feared what it didn't understand and scorned what defied its narrow conventions. The contempt in their eyes was a familiar sting, a bitter aftertaste of other towns, other unspoken reasons, a reminder of the very bitterness he had sought to escape in the isolation of Echo Valley. He had thought he'd left such petty cruelties behind. They eventually tired of his impassivity, of his unyielding silence. With a final round of chuckles and a few more muttered insults, like pebbles skipping across a pond, they reined their horses around. Dust rose behind their backs like cowardice on wheels, billowing around them as they rode off, leaving the valley quiet once more. But the air felt different now, tainted by their venom. The peaceful hum of the wind replaced by the lingering echoes of their derision. A psychic bruise on the landscape. Lana had heard every word. She hadn't been visible to the men from Copper Creek, but she had been there, standing silently behind the weathered barn, her own presence as still and unobtrusive as the deepest shadows. Her eyes were lowered, her face an unreadable mask, betraying nothing of the raw hurt or seething anger she might have felt. Yet, Ethan knew. He could feel it, a subtle shift in the very atmosphere, a weight pressing down that told him she had absorbed every cutting remark, every sneering accusation. Her quiet dignity had always been her armor. But even armor, he realized it with a pang, could not stop the unseen, venomous blows of prejudice. He saw her just for a moment. A fleeting glimpse of her retreating figure as she vanished behind the barn, melting back into the landscape, taking with her an unspoken pain that mirrored his own, a silent suffering that made his own discomfort seem trivial. That night, she didn't come. No kindling appeared, no bundle of herbs, no satchel of corn. The morning after, neither did Elara. The absence was a sharp, sudden blow, a void that yawned wider than any physical distance. Ethan's ranch, which had begun to feel a little less empty, a little less cold over the past days, now felt colder than it should have, emptier than it had been before they arrived. The quiet had returned, but it was a different quiet, now a hollow, aching void where a subtle, blossoming warmth had been. The birds seemed to sing a more mournful tune. The wind whispered with a sharper edge. He tried to go about his chores. He fed Tracker, checked his small herd, but the water from his well tasted like tin, metallic and flat, unable to quench a thirst that was suddenly not of the body. The sky above, usually a vibrant, reassuring blue, looked pale and indifferent, mirroring the desolation in his soul. Every task felt meaningless, every movement heavy, burdened by the new, oppressive emptiness. He missed a silence, that quiet presence that had become an anchor in his days without him even fully realizing it. He missed her hands that never touched him, yet somehow seemed to fix everything she left behind, leaving behind not just provisions, but a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he craved. A quiet expectation that had now been cruelly withdrawn. The emptiness was a physical ache, a gnawing hole in the core of his being. He found himself walking aimlessly, his gaze drawn repeatedly to the eastern ridges, where their camp should have been bustling with the quiet activity he had grown accustomed to observing. A focal point that was now tragically absent. Finally, unable to bear the oppressive silence of his own making, a silence now amplified by their absence, Ethan walked to their camp. The path, usually just a familiar track, felt long and heavy beneath his boots, each step a testament to his burgeoning regret. When he arrived, the camp was desolate, the fire pit cold, most of the temporary structures dismantled, leaving only ghosts of their recent presence. Only Chief Kishon remained, seated by the remnants of the fire, smoking something sharp and aromatic, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, a sentinel of quiet resilience. He looked up as Ethan approached, his eyes holding the familiar, ancient wisdom, but also a hint of something deeper, a quiet disappointment that resonated profoundly within Ethan. "She will not return," the chief said, his voice as steady as always, but carrying an unmistakable gravity. "The weight of a decision made, unless you bring her back." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I said nothing wrong," he stated, his voice a low growl of frustration, a futile defense against a truth he instinctively knew, a justification that felt hollow even to his own ears. He had remained silent, stoic, believing his impassivity was strength, a wall against the world's chaos. Chief Kishon took a slow, deliberate drag from his pipe, then released the smoke into the air, watching it dissipate like fleeting thoughts. His eyes met Ethan's, holding a depth of understanding that transcended mere words, a quiet condemnation of unspoken truths. "You said nothing," the chief countered, his voice quiet but firm, resonating with ancient wisdom. "Sometimes that is worse." The words struck Ethan like a physical blow, sharper and more precise than any insult the men from Copper Creek had hurled. His silence, his refusal to defend or acknowledge, had not been strength in that moment, but a form of abandonment. It was a failure to acknowledge Lana's presence, her dignity, in the face of blatant prejudice. It was a truth he had avoided, a mirror reflecting his own ingrained caution and fear of entanglement, a fundamental flaw in his self-imposed sanctuary. The chief's words laid bare the weight of unspoken expectations, the profound impact of inaction. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. The chief's words echoed the quiet accusation in his own heart, the growing realization that his neutrality had, in fact, been complicity. He turned and walked home, the setting sun casting a long, lonely shadow behind him, a stark symbol of his renewed solitude. The ranch had felt empty before, a chosen void, but now, returning to it alone, it felt like a vast, cold expanse, haunted by the warmth that had briefly touched it and then, just as suddenly, withdrawn. The air tasted bitter, tinged with regret, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan Vance felt profoundly, undeniably lost. His carefully built fortress of solitude had shattered, not by an external assault, but by the weight of its own emptiness. The emptiness that had settled over Ethan's ranch after Lana and Elara's departure festered, a cold, silent wound. He moved through his days with a leaden heart, each chore a stark reminder of the warmth that had briefly touched his life and then receded. The chief's words, "You said nothing. Sometimes that is worse," haunted him, echoing in the vast, empty spaces of his cabin, a constant, nagging indictment of his inaction. He felt a deep, unfamiliar ache, a longing not just for their physical presence, but for the quiet understanding they had offered, the sense of being truly seen for the first time in years. The thought of Lana, hurt and perhaps feeling abandoned by his silence, was a torment he could not shake. As dusk deepened into night, the sky above Echo Valley began to churn with an ominous fury. The wind, which usually carried soft whispers, now howled like a banshee, tearing through the canyons and whipping the dry sagebrush into a frenzied dance. Dark, bruised clouds gathered on the horizon, swallowing the last vestiges of twilight, their edges lit by the flickering, malevolent glow of distant lightning. This was not the gentle autumn breeze Ethan knew. This was a storm, raw and violent, descending upon the valley with a terrifying speed. Rain began to fall, not in gentle drops, but in stinging sheets that cut sideways, driven by the gale force winds. The air crackled with static electricity, and the rumble of thunder grew from a distant growl to a deafening, earth-shaking roar. Ethan stood on his porch, silhouetted against the tumultuous sky, his gaze fixed on the eastern ridges where the Sauk camp lay. A knot of primal fear twisted in his gut. Their shelters were temporary, fragile, no match for a tempest of this magnitude. He pictured Chief Kishon, still recovering from his unknown ailment, and the two young women, vulnerable to the elements, their lives hanging by a thread. The thought ignited a desperate urgency within him, a sudden, powerful surge of purpose that cut through the haze of his regret. His silence had caused a rift. Now, only action could bridge it. Without a moment's hesitation, Ethan dashed into the stable. Tracker whined nervously, sensing the storm's ferocity, but stood steady as Ethan saddled Cisco, his old horse, with practiced efficiency. The stable groaned under the assault of the wind, the boards creaking like a ship caught in a rogue wave. Ethan swung himself into the saddle, pulling his wide-brimmed hat low against the pelting rain. "Come on, boy," he muttered to Cisco, urging the horse forward. They galloped into the teeth of the storm, mud flinging up into Ethan's face, stinging his skin like 1,000 tiny needles. Cisco, despite his age, plunged onward, his powerful legs churning through the deepening mire, battling against the relentless wind that tried to rip them from the earth. Lightning split the sky, carving across the fields like ancient, jagged scars, illuminating the desolate landscape in blinding, momentary flashes, followed by thunder that seemed to tear the very fabric of the world. Through the sheeting rain and the chaotic flashes, Ethan strained his eyes, desperate to spot the Sauk camp. Then he saw it, a horrifying, lurid glow against the blackness of the storm. Fire, real fire, angry and ravenous, consuming the very ground where their camp had been. A gasp tore from his throat. The chief, Lana, Elara, panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him, stripping away every last vestige of his carefully maintained composure. He spurred Cisco harder, urging the horse into a desperate, mud-flinging run, every muscle in his body screaming with urgency. The source of the fire was unclear, perhaps a lightning strike, or perhaps the malevolent work of human hands. A chilling thought quickly overshadowed by the immediate terror of the flames. When they finally reached the camp, the scene was one of utter devastation. Their main tent had collapsed, a twisted mess of canvas and poles, half burning, half drenched, spewing thick, acrid smoke and furious sparks into the raging storm. The air was heavy with the stench of burning canvas and damp wood, a noxious combination. Through the chaos, Ethan saw her, Lana. She was a blur of frantic, desperate movement, struggling to drag a heavy, unmoving form away from the inferno. It was Chief Kishon, his body slumped, clearly injured, perhaps from the collapse or the intense heat itself. And then he heard it, a high-pitched, desperate scream, torn from the throat of Elara, who was trapped closer to the collapsing structure, her small figure illuminated terrifyingly by the leaping, hungry flames. Ethan didn't think. He reacted. He leapt from Cisco's back, even before the horse had fully stopped, landing in the churned mud with a splash. The intense heat from the burning tent washed over him, searing his skin. But he ignored it. He saw a heavy wooden beam pinning a section of the collapsed tent near Elara, a deadly barrier. With a primal roar of effort, he grabbed the beam, muscles screaming in protest, and wrenched it off the side, tearing through charred fabric. He could hear Elara's cries, closer now, laced with raw terror. He burst through a gap in the smoldering canvas, the smoke choking his lungs, burning his eyes, and found Lana. She was clutching her shawl around Elara, shielding her sister from the heat and flying debris, her own body a desperate shield. Her hair was soaked, plastered to her smoke-streaked face, but her eyes, wide with a fierce, unwavering resolve, were dry. There were no tears, only a raw, primal determination etched onto her features. She was protecting her sister, even as the flames threatened to consume them both, a silent testament to her courage. Ethan lunged forward, grabbing Lana's hand, his fingers closing around hers with a desperate, unyielding grip. The touch was electric, a jolt of connection amidst the inferno. "You shouldn't be alone in a storm like this," he said, his voice hoarse, barely audible above the roar of the wind and the crackle of the fire. The words tumbling out without thought, a raw expression of his deepest fear for her. And for them. Lana looked at him, her smoke-filled eyes meeting his. In that moment of utter chaos, surrounded by fire and fury, her gaze was startlingly clear, impossibly steady, holding a depth that seemed to reach into his very soul. "I wasn't alone," she said, her voice a whispered truth that cut through the cacophony, holding both gratitude and an ancient knowing. "You just hadn't arrived yet." He didn't answer. There was no need for words. The truth of her statement, simple yet profound, resonated deep within him, extinguishing the last embers of his regret and uncertainty. He simply wrapped his coat around her shoulders, its thick canvas offering meager physical protection against the elements, but a profound shield against the feeling of being utterly forsaken. His fingers lingered on her arm, a silent, unspoken promise, a solid anchor in the raging tempest. In the heart of the storm, amidst the destruction, a connection, fragile but real, had solidified, forged in fire and shared peril. Together, they worked through the long, harrowing night, a silent, coordinated effort. With Ethan's raw strength and Lana's quick thinking and knowledge of their makeshift structures, they managed to salvage enough charred poles and torn canvas to rebuild a temporary shelter. It wasn't perfect, far from warm in the way a sturdy cabin would be, but it was shelter, a desperate, defiant refuge from the relentless rain and the biting wind. A small island of safety amidst the widespread desolation. Chief Kishon, though weakened and in pain, was breathing shallowly but steadily within its makeshift confines, thanks to Lana's quick thinking and Ethan's intervention. As the first gray, weary light of dawn began to pierce the bruised clouds, casting a pale, exhausted glow over the ravaged valley, a fragile sense of hope began to stir within the battered camp. The fire was out. The storm was dying. And against all odds, they had endured. Their shared ordeal had forged a bond stronger than any words could express. The fierce light of dawn, though pale and weary, found the Echo Valley ravaged but not broken. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of churned mud, broken branches, and a quiet desolation. Ethan and Lana, exhausted but resolute, stood by the makeshift shelter they had wrestled from the storm's fury. Inside, Chief Kishon stirred, his breath shallow but steady, a testament to Lana's swift action and Ethan's desperate intervention. The immediate terror had receded, replaced by the deep fatigue that follows intense exertion, but also by a quiet sense of shared survival. Days blurred into a haze of recovery and rebuilding. Ethan did not return to his ranch immediately. His place felt intrinsically linked to theirs now, by the chief's side, by Lana's, by Elara's. He worked alongside them, silently helping to strengthen the temporary shelter, gathering what provisions they could salvage from the storm's wake, and tending to Chief Kishon's injuries. The chief, though weakened, slowly began to regain his strength, his ancient eyes observing Ethan with a new depth of understanding, a quiet gratitude that needed no words. This shared ordeal, this crucible of fire and storm, had forged a bond that transcended the previous unspoken tension. The boundaries between them, once so clearly defined by tribe and tradition, blurred under the shared weight of necessity and the stark reality of their interconnected survival. As the chief's recovery progressed, Ethan found himself spending more and more time by the small, sputtering fire inside the patched canvas shelter. The air, though smoky, was warm, a stark contrast to the hollow chill of his own distant cabin. Lana was often beside him, tending to her father, or simply sitting in thoughtful silence that was now filled with a comfortable ease. Their conversations were not grand pronouncements, but whispers, hushed words exchanged under the vast, watchful sky of Echo Valley. They spoke of the land, of the unpredictable nature of the weather, of the challenges of survival in this unforgiving wilderness. And as the nights deepened, their voices would lower, venturing into the territories of past scars and future hopes, sharing fragments of lives once fiercely guarded. One night, the embers of the fire casting dancing shadows on the canvas walls. Lana's voice was softer than usual, tinged with a vulnerability Ethan had not heard before. "They don't want me where you come from," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames, speaking of the world of the settlers, the towns like Copper Creek. "Their faces, their words, they say I do not belong." A pause, then a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, a deep sorrow rooted in a sense of displacement. "And I ain't even sure I want me where I come from anymore." Her words were a raw confession, revealing a deep-seated insecurity, a sense of being adrift between two worlds, perhaps not fully accepted by her own people after their forced displacement, nor by the outside society that scorned her. It was the echo of a pain he knew too well, the sting of being an outsider, a soul seeking a place where it truly belonged. Ethan listened, his own past resurfacing in the quiet of her words, the familiar ache of old rejections. He remembered the dismissive glances, the whispers of disapproval that had once driven him to the solitude of this valley, the unspoken judgments that had pushed him deeper into himself. His own retreat had been a reaction to such rejection, a choice to avoid the pain of not fitting in. But Lana's honesty, her raw vulnerability, demanded more than silence from him now. It demanded a response, a truth from the depths of his own experience, a validation that transcended the harshness of the world. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment, then gently, tentatively, settled on her arm. The contact was brief, a mere brush of skin, yet it conveyed a profound understanding, a silent acknowledgement of shared burdens and unexpected solace. "You're not a fire someone gives," Ethan said, his voice low, steady, imbued with a quiet conviction he hadn't known he possessed. His words were not an attempt to diminish her pain, but to reframe her worth. to shift her perspective from one of external validation to internal strength. You're a fire someone earns, a flame that burns because it chooses to, not because it needs permission from anyone else. His gaze met hers, holding a silent promise of recognition, a testament to the powerful, resilient spirit he had witnessed through her quiet perseverance and a fierce protection of her family. The words, simple yet profound, seemed to hang in the air, transforming the smoky confines of the tent into a sacred space. They touched Lana deeply, not as a casual invitation or a fleeting compliment, but as a profound act of permission. Permission to be herself, unburdened by the expectations or rejections of others. Permission to burn brightly, not for show, but for her own inherent truth. Her hand, which had been resting on her lap, slowly, hesitantly, reached out and gently, tentatively, brushed against his. It wasn't an invitation to a physical intimacy he might have yearned for, but a deeper, more significant act, a silent granting of access, a shared acknowledgement of a burgeoning connection that transcended mere words. He didn't kiss her, but in that moment, under the quiet, watchful eyes of Chief Kishon and the sleeping Elara, the air between them thrummed with an unspoken understanding, a silent covenant of trust and mutual respect, a promise of shared future possibilities. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around the Sauk camp began to change. The chief, stronger now, moved with renewed purpose, overseeing the more permanent rebuilding of their homes. Ethan, though his ranch awaited, felt rooted to this place, drawn by an invisible tether to Lana and her family. His heart, once a tightly closed fist, had begun to unfurl, petal by petal, allowing in a warmth he hadn't known it craved. He realized the loneliness he had cultivated was not strength, but a cage, meticulously built to keep out pain, but which also kept out true connection. This emerging bond, built on shared hardship and quiet understanding, was a true liberation. One morning, as the sun rose, heavy and yellow, painting the valley in hues of hope, Ethan knew what he had to do. His purpose was clear, no longer clouded by doubt or the fear of entanglement. He walked back to his ranch, the familiar path now feeling different, imbued with a new sense of meaning. Tracker greeted him with an excited bark, sensing the profound shift in his master. Inside his cabin, a place that now felt less like a sanctuary and more like an empty shell, a mere structure waiting to be filled. He went straight to a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. From it, he retrieved a small, ornate wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a ring. It was his mother's ring, a delicate band of silver, slightly worn but still gleaming with a quiet strength. It was a precious heirloom, a tangible link to his past, worn by his mother through 2 wars and one sorrowful, yet resilient, life. It carried the weight of family history, of unspoken hardships, and of enduring love. It was a symbol not just of commitment, but of continuity, of the ability to carry history forward while forging a new path. It was the only tangible piece of his past he still truly valued. And now, it felt right to offer it as a bridge to a future he had once sworn he'd never seek. The western sky glowed with the promise of a new day as Ethan Vance walked back to the Sauk camp. His mother's ring, a silver circledy of past and future, warm in his palm. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, a fragrance now inextricably linked with a profound shift in his world. He approached the camp with a quiet purpose, no longer burdened by the hesitation that had once defined him. His footsteps, though firm, were lighter, imbued with the weight of a choice finally made, a future he was no longer running from, but willingly stepping into. The rising sun, usually a solitary spectacle for him, now seemed to illuminate a path he was meant to share. Chief Kishon, now stronger, sat by the newly constructed, more permanent central fire. His pipe clutched in his hand, his eyes, ancient and wise, met Ethan's as he approached, and a faint, knowing smile touched his lips. There was no need for words, no elaborate explanations. The chief's gaze swept from the ring in Ethan's hand to Ethan's face, then back again, before settling on the eastern horizon. He understood. The silent gesture, the return to their camp with this precious symbol, spoke volumes of Ethan's commitment, of his willingness to bridge the chasm that had once separated their worlds. The chief's nod was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the full weight of his acceptance. A blessing given in the quiet language of mutual respect. It was a recognition not just of Ethan's courage to leave his solitary world, but of the authenticity of his heart, a validation that resonated deeply, promising a new chapter of understanding between their peoples. A rustle of canvas, and Lana emerged from the temporary dwelling. She wore Ethan's old worn coat, a garment he had wrapped around her during the chaos of the storm. But it was transformed. The edge, once plain, was now carefully patched with intricate sock stitching, mirroring the symbols of stars and waves he had seen on the corn satchel she had left for him. It was a powerful, silent declaration, a merging of their two worlds, a blending of traditions, a visual testament to the harmony they were forging. Her hair, now dry, fell in a single thick braid down her back, and her eyes, deep and quiet, met Ethan's across the space between them. There was no smile, no question in her gaze, only a calm, profound understanding, a reflection of the shared ordeal that had stripped away all pretense. Ethan held out the ring, his palm open, offering the silver band that held so much of his past, a tangible piece of his lineage. Lana didn't take it. Instead, with a graceful movement that spoke volumes of her self-possession, she reached for his hand, her fingers warm and firm against his own. With a deliberate slowness that spoke of sacred intention, she guided the ring onto her own finger, a perfect fit. Her touch was not just physical, it was a connection of souls, a silent covenant forged in shared adversity and a burgeoning affection. She looked at him, her eyes holding a universe of unspoken words, a depth of feeling that transcended language. And then, her voice a quiet, resolute utterance that settled into the core of Ethan's being. She said only one word: now. It was a word that encapsulated acceptance, readiness, and the profound weight of a future beginning in that very moment. And then they simply stood, in the heart of the Sauk camp, under the vast, awakening sky of Echo Valley, surrounded by the quiet hum of a new day and the soft sounds of the re-establishing camp. They stood in profound silence. It was a silence filled to the brim, complete and whole, needing no embellishment, no grand pronouncements. It spoke of battles fought and won, of solitude relinquished for something infinitely more valuable, a connection that promised warmth and belonging. Tracker, who had followed Ethan and waited patiently, chose that moment to let out a single sharp bark, a joyous sound that cracked through the stillness, a small, vibrant testament to the happiness he sensed radiating from his master. It was the only sound needed, a simple punctuation mark on a moment of perfect, unburdened peace. The valley, once a symbol of Ethan's chosen isolation, now seemed to hum with a new, quiet melody of unity. Later that morning, as the sun climbed higher, painting the mesas in hues of rose and gold, Ethan and Lana stood on the porch of his ranch house. They didn't toast their new beginning with whiskey, didn't speak of vows or promises, for their bond ran deeper than words. They just stood side by side, watching the moon begin its slow descent over the far ridge, a silent counterpoint to the rising sun, symbolizing the balance they had found. From that profound, shared silence, something true, something deeply authentic, had blossomed. It was a love that didn't demand attention, didn't require fanfare or validation from the outside world. It came, as the old stories whispered, like snow melting into spring, unexpected, quiet, and utterly full of life, transforming the barren landscape of the heart into fertile ground. They had found a new meaning for their lives, built not on blood ties or societal conventions, but on mutual understanding, quiet resilience, and a love that had grown from the ashes of loneliness and the fires of prejudice. Their story was a testament that sometimes it's not about finding the right person in a world full of noise and judgment, but about recognizing the quiet strength of someone who keeps showing up, relentlessly, faithfully, even when the world, with its harsh judgments and narrow minds, tells her not to. It's about seeing beyond the surface, beyond the initial resistance, to the true spirit within. And if you're lucky enough, one day you'll learn what Ethan Vance did, that true fire doesn't beg to be seen or acknowledged. It waits patiently, profoundly, illuminating the path forward until you finally open your eyes and truly see it, blazing bright, a beacon of hope and belonging in the vast, wild west, marking the quiet, powerful beginning of a truly new, chosen family. The winds of Echo Valley no longer whispered of regret, but of quiet strength and enduring love.